Our Plant Stories has been nominated as a finalist in the Independent Podcast Awards in a new category called Environment and Natural World. I'll let you know how we get on. Thanks to all those who are regular supporters of the podcast with their commitment to buying a monthly coffee. And to Anne, who also sent some caffeine my way this month, all of which goes towards paying for this podcast, the hosting platform and the editing programme. The link is in the show notes. And now, a plant story. Welcome to Our Plant Stories, where we're looking at Anne's old photo album. It's the late 80s, and the image is of a young woman ready for work. I love that picture of you in your office, actually. I think that is just like woman on a mission. Woman on a mission,
yeah.
You know.
The old filing cabinet,
oh, yeah.
Second-hand desk it was.
Above the newsagents.
Yes, the newsagents. People had to come up a rickety old staircase along a tatty corridor, and there was another room at the front which overlooked the street, and I was trying to grow flowers in there, and I had them on the windowsill and I had them for sale. And they always got aphids, I can remember that, having to go out and squidge all the aphids off so that I could sell plants.
So we have Anne, who loves plants, and then we have a book. Have you ever had a moment where you found a gardening book that encapsulates the way you're thinking? You open it and there's a goldmine of ideas and plants that you know you're going to be able to use. Well, such a book is at the heart of this plant story. And for context, I'm sitting on a bench in Norfolk with Anne Harrap, who's the founder of Natural Surroundings, a series of wildlife gardens created from a paddock over the course of almost 40 years. And tell me why the book that you are holding is important to you.
This is How to Make a Wildlife Garden by Chris Baines, and it was the book I bought when I was deciding whether to set up my own business helping people create wildlife gardens. I didn't know it existed. I bought the book. I think he had a series on the television. I also saw him on the television, so I was a bit of a Chris Baines junkie at the time, and I couldn't really get enough. I read it from cover to cover and thought, wow, these are exactly the same thoughts that I've been having, and somebody's written it all down with beautiful pictures, and it's just the sort of information I needed to set me off on the path that I've taken.
Where did your deep love of nature come from originally?
I think growing up in a small seaside town and being allowed to roam when I was young, my parents sort of let me out of, kicked me out almost in the morning in the holiday time and said, don't come back till tea time, or, come back when you want to be fed. And that was how it was most of my childhood. And we roamed the beach, we roamed the cliffs, we roamed the woods. You could walk almost anywhere and get to some lovely habitat. And just being out in it, I think, really inspired me. And my father was quite keen on insects and also pond life, so we used to go and collect frog spawn every year and find newts and things like that. He pointed those sorts of things out. Mother wasn't particularly interested in anything, but she let us roam, and I think we roamed and explored, and that was where I just loved being out and interested in what I saw, I think.
So what had you studied at university or college?
I'd done biology all through, and because probably in the 80s when this was, I'd gone from course to course because I couldn't find a job that I liked. There were jobs in mostly in the chemical industry, farm chemical industry, and I did spend a little time having to go out testing crops and then suggesting what sort of pesticides and herbicides to use, and that wasn't me either. I knew that wasn't for me, so I sort of found another course to go on, basically.
And when you couldn't find a job, what did you do?
Because in the last job was working for the North Norfolk District Council, and at the time they were getting inquiries about people wanting to plant hedges on little bits of land that they'd purchased from farmers. It was a bit of a new thing, I think, people moving up here and buying up a bit of land, and they wanted to put hedges back. So I was sent out as the person who might know about native hedges to talk to people, and that's how the sort of little seed came to me that maybe people would pay for this advice.
And you've got a picture of yourself in the album. I love this picture. Let's just describe this photograph to me.
Okay, so this is me. It says 1987, first home of natural surroundings above Starling's newsagents in Holt. And so this is the local town, and it's a fairly untidy looking room. And I'm sitting by a second-hand desk with this very scruffy old filing cabinet. Everything was second-hand. And this is where I invited people to come and talk to me if they wanted their gardens designed for wildlife in the early days.
I love that. That's so, it's like, okay, I can't find what I look, so I'm just going to create it myself. That's why it's not surprising you created this garden, really, because I'm looking at that photograph. It's fabulous. And then how did you get this plot of land? Okay,
so this was a stroke of luck. The lady I was renting a flat, I knew this estate owner very well. They were big friends, and when I talked to her about what I wanted to do, she said, "Oh, we must go down and talk to Robin," and he was very much up for it, very much of the idea, and he invited me down. I got in the back of his Land Rover with umpteen dogs and other sort of estate paraphernalia. And he drove me around lots of bumpy lanes and showed me various bits of land, including a wall garden. And then we got to this area, which had this beautiful view down the valley. And it had its own acre of wet meadow and woodland, and it fringed the River Glaven. And then there was a nice dry open slope which was just grass at the time. And it was perfect for what I wanted to start to grow flowers, to show people what wildflowers were like.
Wow. And now describe how many gardens you have here.
I think we've got 22 different gardens. So it does take a while, doesn't it, to walk round and talk about them all. You do need a bit of time.
What did you love about the book?
I just connected with it straight away. All the different sections, particularly the wildlife service station, I think he called it, the plant service station for plants, for butterflies and insects to home in on in the summer months, because I knew that would relate to people's gardens. They could grow nice showy plants that would be interesting for them as well as for the wildlife. And I also realised that it's a bit naive just to encourage people to grow wildflowers, because most wildflowers have a much shorter season than we might expect from our garden plants. And although they're lovely, and it's really good to incorporate some wildflowers into your garden, in all aspects of gardening, there's lots of other lovely plants that you can choose.
This is all happening in the 1980s. What happened in the intervening years to that movement? Because I feel now it's very trendy and everyone's been talking about biodiversity and rewilding, but there were people doing this way back. You had obviously been inspired and wanted to do this back in 1987.
That's right. I mean, I was very much out on a limb at the time, and I really struggled actually to make any money. We suddenly had more expenses here. My father bought me the building that's still up as the shop, which we needed. We needed some car parking. We needed toilet facilities, although we didn't have that in the early days. We had a sort of caravan portaloo type thing. We needed water, and we needed labour.
Anne wanted to show people little pockets of habitat So that's why the gardens are quite small, so we can all relate to them and pick up tips from the moth garden or the butterfly or bee garden, a pond, a woodland garden. So education has always been at the heart of it.
I just felt I was battling all the time, and that people needed to know these things. They needed to know that they could grow flowers to attract butterflies and bees. You know, I do feel now that maybe we could have been a bit more showy, but at the time people weren't very interested. You know, our visitor numbers were low. They didn't want to pay for your advice particularly. They thought, you're just talking about weeds or it would all be untidy. We wanted to show that you didn't have to have an untidy garden to have a really wildlife-friendly garden. So that was what it was all about, and we really wanted people to know. So from the early days, we did some little events and we did some interpretation on the gardens, so people could actually go out themselves and read about what they should do, or take away these top tips for what they should do.
I love that about your garden. Plants are labelled. I also have to tell you that there are so many insects buzzing around that they suddenly go past the microphone and you hear a wonderful buzzing noise. But plants are labelled, and there are these fabulous interpretation boards. The first time I came here, I have lots of photographs from that, because it just explains to you. It tells you things, and that feels so often that isn't what happens in gardens sometimes. We wander around them and they're beautiful and we enjoy them, but we don't necessarily come away with our heads brimming with knowledge of what we could do. And that's why the fact that they're quite small spaces is really important somehow.
Yes, it's exactly the sort of people that we want to target, because especially now people seem to have smaller and smaller gardens. They live on big estates where the natural environment seems to be wiped out. It seems to be a sea of fences, and people must think, however can I attract wildlife to these spaces? So they can come here and see just little tiny bits of what they could do, and say, that would fit into that corner. I can still have my little patio. I could fit in a little pond on that corner, or I could just have those cornfield flowers growing each year, and I'll just do that. They can just take away one little thing.
What's your hope for this garden going forward?
Ideally, we'd like to find another couple who would take it on as it is. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but I'm sure there are people out there who would come and run this in the same vein. We are obviously having to think about that now in the future of the gardens, whether we can put the gardens in some kind of trust. The estate is very happy to have the gardens here. It's just finding the right people to manage it.
I so hope you find the right person or people. Either that, or you'll just have to still be gardening it when you're 100.
It'd be nice to have a little bit of time off. I think I'm rewilding my own garden now.
Did you keep using the book? Did the book stay with you as a book you would refer to?
Yes, absolutely. It really did. You can see it's all sort of well thumbed and...
It's just finding someone who thinks the same way, isn't it? Who articulates what you're thinking. That's an exciting moment, isn't it? I'm not alone, basically.
Yes. And even though I'd never met Chris Baines, I had seen him on the television.
And have you ever spoken to him?
No, never spoken to him.
So you've never told him that you created this kind of inspired by, in a way, his book coming along at the right time when you had your thoughts about the garden as well, or knew what you wanted to do? You've never...
No, I hadn't even thought, actually, whether I could write to this person or contact him at all. It wasn't... I don't know, we didn't contact people in the same way. It was all letters, wasn't it? And, stamps, and maybe I wouldn't have had his address, or, whether you wrote to the Pebble Mill studio or something, I don't know.
I just couldn't resist. I just wanted Anne to have the chance, after all these years, to chat to Chris Baines, author of How to Make a Wildlife Garden. So this is quite a few years after you bought the book, but it's great to have you together. You may not have written a letter or managed to phone up, but I'm really glad, in a way, to just have brought the two of you together today. And I think, Anne, maybe you should start, actually. I mean, are there things that you have wanted to ask Chris over the years since you picked up his book?
I would like to know how you got started in all this, because back then, I found people were very like, oh, wildflowers. No, you don't put those in your garden. And I really wanted people to do that. And it was only after I found your book, I'm not sure if I saw you on the television first or which came first, that I really thought, oh, maybe I can work with this, and maybe I can do something like this. And so that's how it started for me.
Well,
how did it start for you?
I think it's really nice to hear, of course. And actually, I think what I always wanted to do was emphasize the idea that I'm actually a gardener and a horticulturalist first and foremost, and that I was not all about creating wilderness or creating nature reserves even, but bringing together gardening and nature. And the origins of that for me were really my parents. My mum was a great gardener. I always say she could have struck roots on a chair leg. She just was brilliant at propagating things. And so she and I were gardening together from a very early age. And in fact, by about the age of 10 or 12, we had a small business together where we were growing rockery plants to sell at the front gate. And all my spending money went on buying very small clay pots to grow the rockery plants in. So she was the gardening bit of it. And my dad was a rambler, really, but he was a teacher, a junior school teacher in my youth anyway. And I always think of him as the kind of nature table teacher. There would always have been a nature table in the class, I'm quite sure, where he was teaching. And years later, actually only a few years ago, I met somebody. I was giving a talk in Sheffield, where I grew up, and I met somebody who was in my dad's class, who said the best day of her school life was the day when it had snowed so heavily that the snowdrifts were about 6 feet high, and my dad insisted that the whole class went outside so they could walk through snowdrifts that were higher than them. And I just thought the school wouldn't have been open now on a day like that. So the combination of the two of them really is where my passion for all of this comes from. And then it was very much fueled, I think, not consciously, but retrospectively it certainly was, by the kind of education I had when I went to study horticulture, because it was in the 60s and I spent 3 years being taught how to kill everything, really. That was at the time when the chemical revolution had started, and the whole mission of horticulture and agriculture was to show that we could dominate nature. And I kind of absorbed all of that, of course, as you do as a student, and didn't really think much about it. And with hindsight, this was about 4 or 5 years after Silent Spring had been published. And Silent Spring was never, ever mentioned in 3 years of education. So I think that in later life certainly has driven me a lot, just realizing that I'm part of that generation that has led to the UK being the most nature depleted country in Europe, thanks to the kind of expertise I was being fed at the age of 20 as an undergraduate student. And really the big breakthrough, I suppose, was Chelsea. But actually, before that, I'd been a kind of a weekly presenter on something called Pebble Mill at One, which is folklore now almost, but was kind of the original Richard and Judy kind of sofa, interesting guests kind of daily event. And I was initially asked if I would just present a series. I'd never done television before in my life, but they put out a call for anybody who knew about community projects. And I was very involved with 2 or 3 community projects in Birmingham, where I was living then. So I wrote in, and as you did then, no email, this was long before all of that happened. and said, well, here are 3 projects I'm very involved with. Are you interested? And they asked me to go in, and I described them. And then they said, well, how would you feel about presenting this particular strand on Pebble Mill at 1? So I suddenly found myself presenting television, live television, which you will recognise as a bit of a baptism of fire, to say the least. Very quickly, they kind of warmed to the idea that I could actually talk about wildlife and gardens. And they already had Peter Seabrook presenting the garden strand. Peter Seabrook was as far removed from me as you could possibly imagine. So he was there in his shirt and tie and blazer, telling people how to propagate tomatoes. And I was there with hair down to my shoulders and a beard, looking fresh from California kind of thing. So it was a great contrast. And Peter had just recently taken over from Percy Thrower, presenting Gardener's World. So this is ancient history now. But he then decided that they were going to do a 2-week makeover on BBC Gardener's World. This is a long explanation of my background, I know, but and Gardener's World was an iconic programme then, as it is now, really. Anyway, Peter had decided that it would be really good to take a couple of gardens on a new town in Peterborough, as it happens, and convert them or create them over a couple of weeks. This is long before the whole kind of garden makeover industry developed. And he said, well, therefore, Chris, would you like to design one of them? I was a landscape architect, and I was a garden designer in real life. So, of course, I jumped at the chance, and I designed. They were 2 identical adjacent plots, and one of them was handed over to the Development Corporation's very orthodox landscape architect, who designed a kind of oval lawn with flower beds around it and absolutely predictable stuff. And I designed something called a rich habitat garden, which was still, by most people's standards, pretty orthodox. But anyway, there was a wonderful moment in the program. This was in 79. And there was a wonderful moment in the 2-week program when Peter kind of stepped through the fence from the orthodox garden into mine and said, and Chris, what's the idea behind your garden? And I said, well, I want it to be a really nice garden for families, but I particularly want to attract as much wildlife as possible. And he just looked at me and said, and you really think Britain's gardeners are going to be interested in that? And it was an extreme put down, really. But I'd produced a leaflet to go with the programme. And because the BBC at the time said, well, nobody would be interested in that, I managed to get English Nature, or whatever they were called in those days, to support this leaflet, produce the leaflet. And then I went back to the BBC and said, well, I've produced this little booklet about how to make a wildlife garden. And since you've said that nobody's going to be interested, would you mind distributing it to anybody who does write in for it? And I rang the week after the programme and they said, oh God, they said, we've got a room full of sacks of letters from people wanting your leaflet. And so that was 79. I mean, that's a very, very long time ago. And that convinced me, I suppose, more than anything, that actually people were interested in it. And actually it wasn't revolution and it wasn't extreme, but it was just actually delivering what lots of people loved from their gardens anyway and wanted a bit of help with. They wanted more butterflies, they wanted more birds, they wanted to feel they were helping the hedgehogs. And nobody else had really legitimised that before, I don't think.
No, that's right. And, even when I started, there was a lot of people just thought I was mad, and I said, well, I want to show people wildflowers. I want to show them that you can grow some of these in your garden and they're lovely things. And people couldn't remember then. They couldn't even remember what some of the wildflowers were, and people still can't now. We have a nursery and we grow wildflowers and we grow other cottage garden plants as well. And I hear people all the time saying, oh, I've never seen that before. Not even, oh, I remember that, but I've never seen that before. And some of them are things like muskmallow or birdsfoot trefoil and, And I think, oh, is that because they aren't in their environment at all anymore? Probably is, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there is this prejudice against native plants being somehow weeds. I was in my garden this spring thinking about that actually, and just looking around and thinking, well, actually, my garden isn't full of wildflowers. It's a mixture, as yours is. But the honeysuckle was about to come out, the native wild honeysuckle. The bird cherry, Prunus pedis, was filling the whole garden with perfume. Daphne mesoreum had just finished flowering, which is the most amazing perfume. There were primroses everywhere, bluebells coming through, and I just thought, well, all of these are native plants, but they are all absolutely stunning in their own right. And the person who really, I think, began to change that attitude, and certainly was the person that persuaded me to do the Chelsea Flower Show, I think, although she never knew she had persuaded me, was Miriam Rothschild, who was a force of nature in every possible sense. So she was the non-banking bit of the Rothschild family. Her father had been basically the foundation of the Natural History Museum, and extraordinary man in his own right. And she had grown up, not gone to school, been self-educated, was collecting ladybirds at the age of 3, and I made a Radio 4 program with her in a series I used to do on Radio 4 called Changing Places, which was about her childhood, really. But she, for quite a few years, had been exhibiting at Chelsea Flower Show in the marquee, in the hallowed grounds of the marquee, just wildflowers cut from the local verges of around her house. She has had a house, and she's long dead now, sadly, but she had a house near Oundle, and so for 2 or 3 years at least, you'd walk into the this extraordinary display of horticulture with giant everything, and there somewhere in the middle would be Miriam in her Wellingtons, because she refused to wear any animal products at all. So she had long flowing dresses and Wellingtons. Regularly went to Buckingham Palace and elsewhere wearing her Wellingtons and her long flowing robe. So she was eccentric in the extreme, but a great scientist. And there she was displaying great bunches of meadow buttercups and oxeye daisies and all these things that were just literally cut by her staff that morning from the road verges of Bedfordshire and shipped down to Chelsea. So she was the person. She even got an RHS award, one of their plant awards. I've forgotten what they're called now, for a wild rose, for a Rosa canina. It was very beautiful, deep pink flower, but was just growing in the hedge on the edge of her land, and she cut 3 or 4 stems of it in flower, took them to the RHS and got an award for it. So she was absolutely in there, determinedly showing people that wildflowers were very beautiful.
And what happened when you did your garden at Chelsea? Because that was the first
Absolutely.
wildlife garden.
40 years ago this year, so 1985. Well, you were saying that people coming to your nursery don't recognise things. In 1985, you could not buy a primrose or a cowslip or anything like that. So I had to grow everything that I planted in my garden, almost everything anyway. And as it happens, I'd had a stroke of luck in that when I first left university and started work, I worked for a nursery, a firm called Blakedown Nurseries, and they had just bought a nursery from a Second World War hero, General Sir Oliver Leese, who was a passionate bonsai grower and cactus grower. And my new boss, this was literally in the first month, I think, of starting work, said, we've just bought this nursery from General Sir Oliver Leese. He's a bit of a hero. And he's been exhibiting at Chelsea for years, and he's never won anything. So you're a designer, Chris. Go out and win him a medal. And so I had this ridiculous situation of being tasked with designing a bonsai display for Chelsea. And I had this kind of introduction to Chelsea through that. I'd been going as a student for years, and it was I was absolutely obviously in the company of greatness, because he would arrive, General Sir Oliver Leese, and turn the beer crate upside down and sit there. He'd had, I think he'd had a foot amputated or something, so he was actually quite infirm. He'd sit there and kind of hold court as people from all around Chelsea would come and pay homage to him and chat to him, and I won him a medal. So I was in the records, I suppose, at the RHS. So when I then decided that I wanted to create a wildlife garden at Chelsea, having decided that if you're going to change things, you really have to influence the influential, and they were all at Chelsea. They clearly, in the RHS, looked down the list and said, oh yes, Chris Baines, he's exhibited before, that's fine, having no idea what they were about to do. And it was, I mean, it was extraordinary when I think about it. So I had no resources, no sponsorship. It wasn't the same then as it is now anyway. And I had no plants. So I had to grow all these things. I got the conservation volunteers to help me to dig the pond. And the thing I remember most about the beginnings of that whole process was that when you arrive at Chelsea, you've got a bit of a football pitch. That's really what it is the rest of the year. So you have no idea where you're going to be. And my bit of football pitch had a corner post and white line on it. So that was a kind of reminder of where it come from. And I wanted daisies in my lawn. And I, of course, got a bit of football pitch without a single daisy in it. So my first day was spent going around all the other show gardens, digging up their daisies and transplanting them into my bit of lawn. So by the end of the first day, everybody knew this nutcase had arrived at Chelsea. And it was wonderful, really. And I'd grown cowslips and things to plant in the lawn. And the other thing that I remember vividly, there were two other plant-related things that I think were quite fun. One was that the day before the judging, there was an awful gap at the back of my garden. Now, all my plants were small and modest, and, you know, things like violets and primroses and things don't make a big show. But there was a pollinator border, as we'd now call it, at the back of the garden. And it had this kind of very glaringly obvious need for something big in the middle of it. And I didn't have anything big. And I went back home rather despondent. And I'd been growing all these things in my vegetable patch. And as a consequence, I completely neglected the vegetables. And there were 2 kale plants that had bolted from the previous year. And they were there about 4 feet high, full of buds, about to flower. So I dug them both up and put them in buckets and took them down to Chelsea and planted them at the back of the garden. They then came into full flower for the day of judging. So clouds of yellow flowers. They sucked in every cabbage white butterfly in the south of London, I think, because, you know, it was just extraordinary. And through the rest of the week, I could hear people in the crowd, and the crowd were all buzzing around my garden and talking about, oh, we've got some of those, and well, whatever is that? And they were all saying, oh, what are those yellow flowers at the back? And it was clear that nobody at Chelsea would ever have let their kale plants bolt. I mean, that would have been scandalous. So that was one thing. And the other thing was that I desperately had wanted to have foxgloves in flower, because they're so beautiful, but I had not been able to grow them to the point where they were flowering. So I kind of resigned myself to that. And then when I was kind of planting the garden up, somebody walked past the garden with a truck with all these wonderful foxgloves in the back of it. And so I said, oh, they're beautiful. Where are they going? And she said, this woman said, oh, I'm taking them to the tip. And I said, oh, why are they going to the tip? She said, well, because the leaves have got holes in. And I said, this is wonderful. Not only are the foxgloves perfect, but they've actually got holes in the leaves, which is exactly what I needed. So I managed to persuade her to, she was slightly open-mouthed and astonished by all of this, but we offloaded her foxgloves, saved them from the tip, and planted them in my garden. And it was actually, they were coming from the display of David Austin roses that that was where they had been destined for. And years later, I was talking to Claire Austin, David Austin's daughter, and she said, I was that person who was towing the truck through Chelsea. And she said, I just couldn't understand what was happening when this bloke jumped out of the bushes and said, can I have your foxgloves? Because they've got holes in the leaves. So it was fun, to say the least.
I love in your book, though, you tell us what they wrote on the back of your medal.
Yeah, well,
So you got a medal, did you?
I did get a medal, which was the first astonishing thing. And on the back of it, it says to J.C. Baines for his wildfire garden. Because clearly the RHS, or whoever wrote the medals anyway, could not get their head around the idea 40 years ago that you could have wildlife and garden in the same sentence. And when I got the medal through the post, I contacted them and said, there's a mistake on the back of the medal. It should say wildlife garden. And they said, oh, send it back. And I said, no, I think I'll hang on to it. And I still have it and treasure it. And this year, for the 40th anniversary, I was at Chelsea, and I was a guest of the president, who miraculously is called Keith Weed. Can you believe that could be quite as appropriate? So I was able to show him my Chelsea medal with this error on the back, which was a great, very satisfying moment, I must say.
I love that, that both of you just gravitated towards this. You obviously then went on to write the book after that event. When does the book first publish? It's been republished many times.
It's the 4th edition now. It's been in print ever since. We launched it on that garden, actually. So that book was published in 85.
But that's all 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I find, and now we're coming back round again, aren't we? We're talking a lot about insects and wildlife. And for both of you, what happened in the intervening years? Why did it not just take off and we're not in a completely different place now? I feel like we're playing catch up slightly. Was that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that it didn't really take off. I mean, our little business, I know we're stuck up here in North Norfolk, and that probably didn't help us because half of our catchment is the sea, and it's quite a low population up here. So in those first years, we had a lot of interest from schools. We used to have school parties come to walk around and do pond dipping and show them how to make a bird box and that sort of thing. But the public was a bit slow to take it on board, so much so that we actually, I had a partner after a couple of years and it didn't make enough money. So basically I had to go and leave it, which was heartbreaking. But, we couldn't make it work. And it's been going all the time ever since in various guises. But for a long time, it was much more of a schools sort of place to go. And that's where they made the money. And they also had to do quite a lot of conservation management, because we did used to do sort of consultancy then. And people what used to happen up here, people bought bits of farmers' fields. So they were obviously all getting a bit richer and having their second home, buying a little bit of field so they could have a bit more countryside, and then not knowing what to do with it. So they would want to be putting back a native hedge or planting a native woodland. And it was a while before there was a few people wanting a meadow, but that was like the next thing, really. Oh, how do we do a hay meadow? And a pond, obviously, that was the other thing. So that's sort of what was our main thing earlier on, was schools and helping people, do something lovely with a bit of old arable field that they'd bought.
I think your situation and mine are really very different. I've always been very urban. I grew up in Sheffield. We moved to the edge of Sheffield, and then it got completely built over, my landscape in my childhood. And I've lived in the Black Country, basically, in the West Midlands for the last 50 years. And I'm looking out of the window here in Wolverhampton, inner city Wolverhampton, but I'm looking into an urban forest, really, because this is a Victorian city, and it's much older than that, but the planting is Victorian, really. So my garden is tiny, but it's actually sitting as a kind of a woodland glade in this urban forest, and it's at the moment absolutely packed with baby birds of one kind or another. And I do think that the change has been spectacular. It's not that there isn't much more to do. I look at my neighbours here, and there are two or three unconverted neighbours here, shall we say, but there are also a surprising number of ponds. The University of Sheffield did some work 10 years ago now and reckon there are 10,000 garden ponds in that one city. And you think about how many ponds we've lost in the Norfolk countryside, for instance.
Yeah.
It means that the urban landscape has been, I think, the salvation of dragonflies and damselflies and frogs and newts and toads and many other things. That doesn't mean there aren't pressures here as well. Of course there are. But it was that whole idea that you don't need an acre to be able to do this. What you really need is to see your patch in the mosaic of your neighbourhood. And if you can create a kind of service station for wildlife in your little patch, then you'll inherit all of the wildlife around you. So the birds that feed in my garden don't all nest in my garden, but because I've got a bird feeder, they come to my garden. And lots of people have experienced that. And although it's a kind of blunt instrument, if you just think about how big the market now is in bird food and bird feeders and nest boxes and cameras for nest boxes and pond liners and all of these things, they're a measure anyway of how much more orthodox all of this has become, to the extent that people like you, Anne, and me, who've been on this journey all the time, perhaps are kind of unaware of it because it creeps up on you. But that's why it's quite useful, I think, to cast your mind back 40 years and think, yeah, you couldn't buy a cowslip or a primrose in the garden centre then. That the stacks of slug pellets were even bigger then than they are now in garden centres, and you certainly didn't have things like that. I mean, the bird feeding industry is another good measure, really. In those days, bird feeding was all about plastic nets full of peanuts. And in my childhood, it was all about breadcrumbs on the back lawn. And I always say one of the great entertainments in my family was watching my dad trying to chop coconuts in half without chopping his fingers off. Well, coconuts were the sophisticated end of bird feeding. Bags of peanuts were somewhere in between, and breadcrumbs were actually the other end. And grey squirrels did for the plastic nets of peanuts. I mean, they wouldn't last 2 seconds in my garden now. But you then look at the scale and range of bird feeders and bird food particularly. It's just transformed in that 40 years. And so the range of birds that are now feeding on people's bird feeders is hugely greater than it was 30 or 40 years ago, because the range of food is much greater. You can now buy fat bars with dried insects in them. This is sophisticated gourmet food for birds. And the insects are the way in which we've managed to now have blackcaps, for instance, staying right through the winter, insect feeding birds, partly climate change, but partly what we've been doing with gardens. So I think there have been some of them very subtle changes, but nevertheless really big changes. And for me, I suppose one of the real measures is Chelsea itself. And if you do look at the gardens that are designed at Chelsea, one of the gratifying things is that it's the very young designers, I think, that really understand all of this and are really engaging with it. So I'm, as you can probably tell, eternally optimistic. But I actually think there is cause for optimism there. In the face of absolutely no cause for optimism in the wider landscape. I mean, I just think it's an absolute tragedy what's happened in my lifetime to the wider countryside. And part of the problem is that same younger generation have no concept of what we've lost. You know, the shifting baseline, as it's called, is really so. So this year, everybody is enthusing about how many more butterflies there are. It's been a fantastic spring for butterflies. They have no idea what it was like 30 years ago. They had no idea at all. So, people are saying, I had both a red admiral and a peacock butterfly on my buddleia bush.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, well, wonderful, that's better than one or the other. But there were days, certainly in my mum's garden, when there would be 30 or 40 of those butterflies on a bush.
We had a buddleia bush up against the garage in our garden, and it was always absolutely covered. It's one of my really strong childhood memories, covered in butterflies. They were everywhere over it. It was extraordinary.
So we've really lost that in my lifetime, and just last year, at the end of 23, I think it was, the government published its State of Nature report, which was the official statement of how things are doing. And this was measuring the state of nature between 1970 and 2023. And 60% decline in farmland birds in an area like Norfolk, for instance, because of the way in which agriculture's gone. Loss of 93% of the wildflower meadows, and absolute litany really of loss. And I thought, well, my career started in 1970. So this is absolutely the track record of my entire career in conservation. 60% decline in farmland birds. Half the earthworm population in Britain is gone. These are catastrophic losses.
Yeah, I feel like that as well. That I think, I should have been doing more. Should have been doing more. But
think how much worse it would be even than that if you hadn't been out there doing it, though.
I was going to say, you two have both done so much, and are still doing so much. I mean, we always have a how to grow part of this podcast at the end. And I guess my question to both of you would be, can you think of some kind of starter points for people to really, if they haven't already, kind of find their way into this world and thinking about their gardens as really wildlife friendly? I'm going to put number 1 and number 2. Number 1 is buy Chris's book, A Companion to Wildlife Gardening. And number 2 is
buy it for somebody else as well.
Buy for somebody else as well, correct. And then go and visit Natural Surroundings in Norfolk and see 22 different gardens that will explain to you for butterflies, for moths, for bees, because those two things you will be set and full of ideas. But from both of you, a couple of thoughts each on what you think is a way that people can really just begin to, because it's like the hook that grabs you in, isn't it, and then starts you down that journey.
Well, I think a pond, you've got to have some water there because it brings in all sorts of different types of creatures, and people still don't really get dragonflies. I think they don't tend to see them much unless you've got some water. You won't see dragonflies and damselflies, and they're just amazing for people. We have a pond which I think we've got about 18 different species at Natural Surroundings, and people just come back amazed when on a good day when they've seen several of them. It's just so water in your garden, definitely.
Yeah, and then their discovery that dragonflies don't actually bite you, which is a measure of how little people now know about things. Well, water absolutely is the key, and I'm looking out of the window today. I have a pond, a naturalistic pond, and it's great for damselflies and dragonflies. But in that garden of all those years ago on Gardener's World, I didn't put a pond in because I wanted it to be a garden that people would feel their kids could enjoy, and there's a paranoia about ponds in gardens and young children. So I put in a bubbler fountain, buried a water tank, put a grid over the top, covered it in pebbles, and had a pump in the bottom that just circulated the water. And in the garden here, outside the window, when we first moved here 30 odd years ago, there was one big boulder in the garden that I couldn't easily shift. And I managed to get the local monumental masons to drill a hole through the middle of it. It sits outside my window now, on top of a grid, on top of a tank, with a pump underneath it. And this morning I counted 9 different species of birds bathing on it. And the baby blue tits at the moment kind of form a queue, literally, all around the edge of it. And one by one, they jump on top of this little jet of water and bounce up and down, wash their feathers, and then they get shoved off by the goldfinches. And that's absolutely child safe. It couldn't be safer. So I agree with you, water is one of the things. And the other thing in terms of planting is that I think starting with annuals is the key, really. When I was 2.5, I suppose, I grew my first crop of Californian poppies around the edge of my sandpit in the city Sheffield. I've never managed to grow them quite so well ever since. But, I mean, they're brilliant for hoverflies. And if you think about it, annuals have to be brilliant for pollinators, because if they don't get pollinated, that's the end of them. So growing very simple annuals, not necessarily native annuals, although some of them are absolutely stunning, and then taking the trouble to really look in detail, get down on your hands and knees, look not just at the big bumblebees that come in, but actually at the tiny little beetles that are in there. And in the days when I was much more involved with school grounds and that kind of thing, which Anne was always also talking about, I used to do something. We used to do length of string safaris, give the kids a yard of string, and they'd put it down in the grass and then crawl along it, so that their noses were kind of inches from the ground. And of course, were mesmerised to discover how much life there was down among the stems of grasses. And I think if you start to look in that kind of detail at your garden, you'll be astonished at how much there is out there that you would otherwise just miss. And that's encouraging, because actually if it's working at that kind of level, then the odds are it's going to be working at the higher level and the most spectacular level too.
Yeah, I think be observant is a good thing, and curious, to go and have a look.
And the whole kind of citizen science side of it, Big Garden Birdwatch, 750,000 families or something now, just sending in their records from one weekend to the RSPB and the British Trust for Ornithology, and Bee Watch and Frog Watch and all the other watches that are going on. Those are all to do really with empowering people and giving them the sense that A, it matters, B, you're not odd in being interested in it, and C, you can make a difference.
I think we owe a debt of gratitude as gardeners to people like Anne and Chris, who stuck to their principles through the years, showing us how to work with nature and wildlife. And I really hope that in time Chris will get to visit Anne's gardens and see for himself what his book inspired. There will be photographs and links on the website, ourplantstories.com. I recently returned to natural surroundings because I was asking Anne for some advice. I volunteer in a garden that wraps around the Museum of Homelessness in North London. We'd love it to be full of insects, bees and butterflies like Anne's gardens are. So she and I ventured out with a sack and some trowels, and we dug up a selection of plants that had self-seeded around her gardens. Honesty, evening primrose, verbascum, teasels, forget-me-nots, all plants which will attract birds and insects. They have now been planted in their new home in North London. I am always touched by the generosity of gardeners, both with plants and knowledge. And listen out for an Offshoot episode coming soon, a tour around some of the 22 gardens with Anne. Our Plant Stories is an independent podcast presented and produced by me, Sally Flatman. And if you've enjoyed it, please think about rating and reviewing it on your podcast app.